The war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Japan. Their mighty navy had been shattered in great sea battles. Their best pilots were gone. Their empire was shrinking, island by island, under the relentless advance of American and Allied forces. For the Japanese High Command, the situation was desperate. They could not win a traditional war, so they decided to change the rules entirely. They turned to a weapon that was as much psychological as it was physical: the kamikaze. The word itself, kamikaze, means divine wind. It came from an ancient story of a typhoon that destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet, saving Japan centuries before. Now they hoped for a new divine wind. But this one would be man-made. They began recruiting young pilots, many of them university students with only basic flight training. Their mission was not to fight, but to die. They were to crash their planes, loaded with extra fuel and bombs, directly into Allied ships. Think about what this meant for the sailors on those ships. In a normal battle, a plane is a threat that comes and goes. You shoot at it, it drops bombs or torpedoes, and it flies away. There's a duel. There's a chance it will miss. But with a kamikaze, there was no duel. There was only a certainty. Every plane that approached was a guided missile with a human brain, and its only goal was to hit you. The pilot had already accepted his death. This created a terrifying, constant pressure. You couldn't relax. You couldn't celebrate driving a plane away because it wouldn't leave. This tactic was designed to break the spirit of the Allied navies, to make them so fearful that they would lose their will to fight. And one ship, the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia, would find herself standing directly in the path of this storm, becoming a test case for this horrifying new form of warfare. Before she was a scarred survivor, HMAS Australia was a symbol of national pride. She was a county-class heavy cruiser, one of the largest and most powerful ships in the Royal Australian Navy. To understand her size, imagine a steel giant longer than 2 football fields placed end to end. She displaced 10,000 tons of water, a colossal weight of armour, machinery and weaponry. Her main armament was her 8 8-inch guns, mounted in 4 great turrets. These guns could fire a shell weighing over 250 pounds a distance of more than 15 miles. When they fired, the entire ship would shudder from the force. But she wasn't just about offence. She was equipped with dozens of smaller anti-aircraft guns, 4-inch cannons, quick-firing 40mm pom-poms, and 20mm Oerlikon cannons meant to create a protective wall of steel against enemy aircraft. More than just steel, she was a community. Her crew was a floating town of over 700 men. Let's put faces to that number. There was the captain, Emile Deschenaux, a calm and respected leader from Tasmania. There was Commodore John Collins, the senior officer overseeing the Australian squadron. But below them were the men who made the ship live. There were young boys like 18-year-old able seaman John Smith, who had never been to sea before the war. There were seasoned veterans like Chief Petty Officer William Bill Jones, who knew the rumble of every engine and the smell of every compartment. There were cooks who prepared meals in the galley, radio operators who maintained contact with the fleet, and sick berth attendants trained to deal with the horrors of battle. They came from every corner of Australia, from the big cities of Sydney and Melbourne to tiny outback towns. They argued, they joked, they shared photos of their families, and they forged a bond as strong as the steel around them. The ship was their home, their protector, and their reason for being. October 21st, 1944, began like countless other days for the crew of HMAS Australia. The ship was stationed in Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, part of the massive Allied effort to liberate the islands. Her job that day was naval gunfire support. This meant sailing close to the shore and using her massive 8-inch guns to blast Japanese bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions, clearing the way for American troops to land on the beaches. As the sun rose, the crew was already at their action stations. This was a state of high alert, where every man was at his post, ready for a fight. On the bridge, Captain Deschaneux and Commodore Collins scanned the horizon. In the gun turrets, loaders stood by with heavy shells. High up on the mast, lookouts squinted into the bright sky, their binoculars sweeping back and forth. At 6:05 a.m., the routine shattered. A lookout's voice crackled over the intercom. Aircraft! Bearing 275, low and fast. All eyes turned to see a single Japanese Zero fighter. It was skimming the waves, a tactic to avoid radar for as long as possible. It was heading straight for them. The ship's defensive response was immediate and thunderous. The 4-inch guns boomed first, their shells exploding in black puffs around the tiny plane. As it came closer, the quicker-firing guns joined in. The 40mm Bofors guns began their distinctive pom-pom-pom sound. Finally, the 20mm Oerlikons, manned by individual sailors, opened up with a sharp, frantic crackle. The sky around the plane was filled with metal and fire. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Zero was hit. A piece of its wing flew off. It trailed smoke. A cheer started to rise from some of the gunners, but it died in their throats. The plane did not swerve. It did not climb away. It kept coming, unwavering, its engine screaming. In those last few seconds, a terrible understanding dawned on every man who watched. This was no ordinary attack. The pilot was not trying to avoid them. He was aiming for them. He was steering his damaged plane directly into the heart of the ship. The impact was a cataclysm of noise and force. The Zero, its fuel tanks full, smashed directly into the ship's bridge. The explosion was not just a bang. It was a consuming fireball that engulfed the command center. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and fire erupted everywhere. When the smoke and chaos cleared slightly, the devastation was absolute. The bridge, the brain of the ship, was destroyed. Captain Deschaneux was mortally wounded, his body torn by shrapnel. He would die later that day. Commodore Collins was critically injured, a piece of shrapnel lodged in his lung. Many of the men standing with them, helmsmen, signalmen, junior officers, were killed instantly. In a single violent moment, the HMAS Australia had been decapitated. The men were left in shock, grieving, and facing a fear they had never known. If the first attack was a shocking tragedy, what followed was a relentless nightmare. The HMAS Australia, though wounded, was still a powerful warship. The decision was made for her to stay on station and continue her mission. This meant she remained a glowing target on the Japanese tactical maps. The attacks came not as a single battle, but as a series of brutal, soul-crushing hammer blows. October 25, 1944. Just 4 days after losing their captain, the crew was again at action stations. Another kamikaze, this time a Val dive bomber, broke through the defensive fire. It slammed into the port side of the ship, near the waterline. The explosion tore a huge hole in the hull. Icy seawater began to pour in. The damage control parties, already exhausted, now faced a new fight for the ship's survival against flooding. October 26, 1944. The nightmare continued. A third suicide plane, likely another Zero, streaked out of the sky. This one crashed into the base of the ship's large funnel. The impact destroyed lifeboats and scattered burning aviation fuel across the decks, starting a massive fire that threatened to spread to the ammunition stored for the smaller guns. October 27th and 30th, 1944. The 4th and 5th kamikazes struck. The ship was now being systematically torn apart. Her upper decks were a junkyard of twisted metal. Her once proud silhouette was mangled. For the crew, life became a blur of terror and exhaustion. They slept at their guns, if they slept at all. They ate cold food. The constant sound of alarms, the roar of guns, and the scream of aircraft engines became the soundtrack of their lives. They fought fires, carried wounded friends to the overwhelmed sickbay, and buried their dead at sea in simple, heartbreaking ceremonies. The psychological toll was immense. Every man wondered, will I be next? When will this end? While the gunners topside fought their very public battle against the diving planes, another, more secret war was raging deep within the bowels of the ship. This was the domain of the damage control parties, the true unsung heroes of the HMAS Australia. Imagine the scene after a hit. The lights flicker and die, plunging corridors into darkness, broken only by the flicker of flames. The air is thick with choking, black smoke from burning fuel and electrical wires. The smell of explosives and something more terrible, burning flesh, hangs in the air. The ship groans and shudders like a living thing in pain. Into this hell charged the damage control crews. These were not just specialized teams. Every available sailor, cooks, clerks, storemen might be called upon to help. Their tasks were a matter of life and death. Fighting fire. They dragged heavy, unwieldy hoses through narrow, debris-filled passages. They battled infernos that could melt steel, knowing that if the fire reached the magazines where the shells and cordite were stored, the entire ship would vanish in a single, catastrophic explosion. Stopping the sea. When the hull was breached, the ocean poured in with unimaginable force. These men would wade into chest-deep, freezing water in pitch darkness, trying to find the source of the leak. They used everything from specialized patches to mattresses to plug holes. They then manned powerful pumps for hours, fighting to keep the ship from listing too far and capsizing. Saving systems. They worked to restore power, to repair shattered steam pipes that hissed scalding vapor, and to shore up collapsed bulkheads, the walls between compartments, with heavy timber beams. These men displayed a different kind of courage. It wasn't the quick, explosive bravery of the gunner, but a slow, grinding, and determined courage. They faced suffocation, drowning, and being trapped in a dark, sinking steel box. Without their skill, their training, and their sheer refusal to quit, the HMAS Australia would be nothing more than a name on a list of ships lost in battle. By November 1944, the HMAS Australia was a pitiful sight. She limped away from the Philippines, her superstructure a twisted wreck, her hull patched with temporary steel plates. She sailed to the major naval base in Sydney, where the public saw her damage for the first time. The newspapers, searching for a way to describe her, called her HMAS Achilles, highlighting her many wounds. The crew, those who were left, disembarked. They were hollow-eyed, thin, and carried the invisible scars of what they had endured. They were sent home on leave to try and piece their lives back together. Any reasonable person would have said the ship's war was over. She had given more than anyone could ask, but the war was not reasonable. In early 1945, the Allies were preparing for their next major assault, the invasion of Lingayen Gulf in the Philippines, a direct gateway to the capital Manila. The plan required every big gun available. The High Command looked at the repaired HMAS Australia and made a fateful, and many would say cruel, decision. She was to return to combat. For the veterans of the previous attacks, receiving these orders was a devastating blow. They had to leave their families and their peace behind to sail back into the very heart of the terror they had barely survived. Many of the original crew were gone, killed, wounded, or transferred. Their places were taken by new young sailors who now had to serve on a ship with a fearsome reputation. The voyage north in January 1945 was surely filled with a heavy sense of dread. The veterans knew what was coming. The new men could only guess, their imaginations fed by the grim stories of the old hands. On January 5th, 1945, the HMAS Australia was back on the front line, stationed in Lingayen Gulf. The crew was tense, every man straining his senses for the first sign of an attack. They didn't have to wait long. The air raid alarm blared, a sound that now triggered a deep, visceral fear. The guns began their frantic chorus, filling the sky with a protective screen of flak. And then, it happened. A Japanese plane, weaving through the storm of steel, broke through. It dove toward Australia. Despite everything the gunners could do, the sixth kamikaze found its mark. The crash was another symphony of destruction. The roar of the explosion, the scream of tearing metal, the whoosh of igniting fuel. For the men who had been through this 5 times before, it was a horrific moment of déjà vu. It was the confirmation of their worst fears. The ship was a magnet for this horror. This final blow added more names to the ship's tragic roll call. When the fires were put out and the dead and wounded were counted, the final awful tally of the entire ordeal could be made. In total, across all 6 kamikaze attacks, 86 men of the HMAS Australia had been killed. Over 150 had been wounded, many of them maimed for life. The ship had set a record no one wanted. She was the most heavily kamikaze-damaged Allied ship to survive the war. The survival of the HMAS Australia is one of the great stories of naval history. People often ask for a simple explanation. Was it the strong hull? The skilled repairs? The answer is that it was all of these things, but it was something more. It was the unbreakable spirit of her crew. The ship's strong county-class design meant that while her upper works were devastated, her core hull integrity often held. This was a vital factor. But steel does not fight back. Steel does not make decisions. The real strength came from the men. It was the 20mm Oerlikon gunner who stood his ground as a plane filled his entire vision, firing until the last second. It was the damage control worker who, half suffocated by smoke, found the strength to hammer one more timber brace into a collapsing bulkhead. It was the young medic who, surrounded by carnage, continued to calmly bandage wounds and comfort the dying. It was the junior officer who, after the bridge was destroyed, took command and made the decisions that kept the ship fighting. They were driven by a powerful force, love for their ship and loyalty to each other. They were not just saving a vessel, they were saving their home and their family. This bond, this refusal to let their shipmates' deaths be in vain, was the true armour that protected HMAS Australia. It was a spirit that no bomb or plane could break. After the war ended in 1945, the battered and weary HMAS Australia was no longer needed. She was retired from service and, in 1955, she was sold for scrap. The great ship was cut apart, her steel melted down for new purposes. But you cannot scrap a memory. You cannot melt down a legacy. The story of HMAS Australia is remembered today for 2 powerful reasons. First, she is a symbol of incredible resilience. She is known as the ship that wouldn't sink, a testament to toughness and the will to survive against impossible odds. Her name is spoken with respect and awe in naval history. But the second, and more important reason, is to honour the sacrifice of her men. The 86 sailors who died were not just numbers. They were individuals with names, faces, and families who mourned them. They were men like ordinary seaman Thomas Davies, 19, from Perth, who dreamed of being a farmer, or Chief Stoker Robert Miller, 42, a father of 3 from Brisbane. Their lives were cut short in a series of violent, fiery moments far from home. The story of the HMAS Australia is a permanent reminder of the true cost of war. It is a story of horror, but also one of breathtaking courage, loyalty, and the strength of the human spirit. It is a story that must be told to every new generation, so that the memory of the unbreakable ship and her unbreakable crew will never, ever fade.